some research that is coming to an end, and the research team is myself and Derek King, Martin Knapp, Madeline Stevens, who I've all told to go to other sessions because they've heard it all before. And also we had 2 advisory groups, one of which was a young adult carers advisory group, which Cassie was part of. So our research focused on what we mean by young adult carers in this, there's various definitions, but ours was on 16 to 25-year-olds providing unpaid care to adults, which most 16 to 25-year-olds do. And the reason we're interested in this group of young people was because they were providing care often since quite a young age and during quite critical times for their educational development and mental health. We know that it's a very formative time for mental health, mental ill health and mental good health, and also primary and secondary school. And so caring during this time can have quite long-term consequences. It's an age of lots of key life transitions, going on to further or higher education, leaving home, personal relationships, and I've missed one, employment. And caring providing care can disrupt these transitions. And in common with other carers, there is a potential for some negative impacts of providing care, particularly certain types of care or quite high hours of care, on their mental health and well-being, education and employment. So I'm just going to show you a couple of tables. This is from Health Survey for England, where we pooled the data from 3 or 4 years. And in this data set you can compare young adult carers to young people of the same age, and what I was just saying, there's less of them were in employment, had poorer self-reported health, and more likely to report having a mental health condition. And then this is understanding society. What we can do with understanding society is we can look at people who have been a carer at one time point and look at some of the outcomes a year or 2 later when the data's next collected. So again, similar things, more likely to be unemployed, to have left employment, and have poorer mental and physical health. So what can be done to prevent some of these negative impacts? One of the things we wanted to look at was if you prevent or reduce care having to be provided in the first place, and there's alternative support, you would hope to prevent some of those impacts happening in the first place. So we looked at adult social care services, and by this we mean services for the person with care needs, and this in the Care Act. This was one of the things that was brought in with the Care Act, the 2014 Care Act, where services can be provided for the care recipients to meet the carer's needs. So that was one of the reasons we looked at these services. And these needs include some of the areas where we see some of the more negative consequences of caring. When we talked to young carers and young carers groups, this was one of the things they expressed, the need for better services, more services for the person they were supporting. And also we'd done previous research, also SSCR funded research on working age carers, and this showed that if the person they cared for was receiving services, they were more likely to be in employment. And other research has shown that receiving services, so-called replacement care services, result in better quality of life and well-being. So to look at the role of these services for this age group in particular, we carried out analysis of data that had already been collected. The Health Survey for England was our main one, as I've just mentioned. That has to ask some of the questions about services. We also looked at the survey of carers in households and understanding society, where we looked at some impacts and costs. We carried out our own survey of young people who provide care. We reach them through a number of methods, through young carers groups, through educational establishments, but also for groups, for example, for young refugees or other groups like that, where people may not identify as a carer, but often have caring responsibilities. And then we carried out telephone interviews with 14 of the young people who also took part in our survey. So this is from the survey, the next slide, but also we found this in Health Survey for England, but I'll just talk this through. Slightly contrary to what we expected, young people were more likely to report effects of caring on their employment if services were received. For education and health, the picture was a bit more mixed. It was sort of in that direction, but it wasn't statistically significant. And we took into account, like other research in this area, we tried to look at care need by looking at care provision. That's often how it's been done when you can't pair the person with care needs and the carer. So we followed very, very similar methods. We looked at care need by looking at care hours and type. That did make a slight difference. This also takes into account carers' characteristics such as their gender and their age and household composition, their own health, and various factors like that. Why does the association between services and carer outcomes appear to be different from what we found previously and from what other people have found previously? There are two things that we considered. It's firstly, the context is a bit different. It's post-Care Act, which has brought in new ways of working with carers, and it's also in a time of fiscal austerity. And the carer characteristics in our research were quite different. As I said, they're 16 to 25-year-olds. Other research has often been done on people who care in midlife, so have come to caring having maybe developed education and employment and so on. So I'm just going to look at context first. We don't know from the survey which way round the relationship is, so it could be we're seeing a greater association between outcomes, young people's needs, the effects of caring, and service receipt, because those needs are triggering services, and this is one of the things that was supposed to be happening under the Care Act. As I say, we don't know the direction from the survey or Health Survey for England, so we looked to our interviews to look at direction and the way things were going. So we did see very few examples where this was actually happening, where the young carers' needs were taken into account to trigger services. But we didn't really find very much evidence for this. Not many people thought this had happened. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, of course, but the young carers themselves didn't feel this had happened. And most hadn't had a carers assessment. In the national data, it was 4%. So they hadn't had assessment of their needs, and of those, the few that did have an assessment, there was sort of no obvious evidence of a service outcome. So the other thing that has changed post-Care Act is the care need of the care recipient is always has been really associated with service receipt, but the concentration of services under kind of the fiscal austerity has meant that it's increasingly concentrated among people with much higher needs. Not to say everyone with high needs is getting services, but more of the people getting services are in high, very high need. And so care need is not only associated with higher service, with service receipt, but also with the level of unpaid care, which is, and that is associated with the effects. That is associated, level of care or type of care, in fact, is associated with greater effects of caring. So why doesn't service receipt have a better effect on the effects of caring? Well, one of our hypotheses was because they weren't received at a sufficient level to alleviate caring to a level that didn't impact on these areas of their lives. Hopefully, so we went to, in the survey we asked carers, is the person you're caring for receiving the right amount of services? And we saw that there is an association between impacts on caring and whether they're getting the right amount of services or not. So the dark blue bar is not getting enough services, and then you can see that is having a bigger effect. But it's not a huge difference, and as I'll return to later, the right amount of services wasn't the only factor. So in the interviews, we did see examples of services relieving caring responsibilities to some extent, and sometimes entirely, although this was sometimes only temporary. And so without services we might have seen more impacts. And we did see examples where services were seen as very helpful, but just more were needed. So this is a quote from Daphne. So she says, but then that's not good enough with me being at college. I thought it's good getting her out, but 3 hours is not good for my mum or for the person who's caring for her. They can't do much in that time. So this is 3 hours a week, and her mother has mental health problems and physical disability. So you see 3 hours a week wasn't really enough for Daphne to go to college and not have things disrupted. And as she says, not good for her mother or, in fact, the paid carer. And if there's not enough services, obviously it meant that the young person would have to fill some of the gaps in service provision, but it was also very stressful, often because of experience the person they care for, not being treated or getting more unwell. So this is Isabel. My mum not having support, it made me constantly worry, because even now when I know she's bad, I'm like, am I going to come home and find my mum's in hospital or worse? Because it used to be that she could be left in the house on her own, but now she can't. And then Cleo, it's been so hard to get her services over the years, just to get her into mental health services. It's so stressful, just getting the help, or the fact she's not getting the help she needs. And we saw several reasons why people weren't getting enough services. In some cases, not enough were received to start with. There was quite a lot of circumstances where services weren't responding to changing care needs, or often changing family circumstances. So sometimes the other adult in the house was no longer living in the house, or there was various sort of things happening. So services had come in place but not adapted. And we saw quite a few examples of services being cut, or more often just being stopped when they were still perceived as needed. Well, she used to have a psychologist, like a team. She used to go every week for an appointment over 2 years, and then they just stopped it because of funding. And it was detrimental to my mum's health, and it took her downhill so much. So on the more bright side, when people did get enough services, and there were some examples of that, it meant they didn't have to miss school or college, could go to work, and had better peace of mind when they were doing so. They've helped massively. If we didn't have the carers, then I wouldn't be able to work. This is Ashley. And again, it meant they had less caring to do, but also it's a sort of shared responsibility. And they were less worried and stressed about the person they support. The other thing was quite important, is it enabled the young person to have more free time, which was good for their well-being, gave them a bit of a break, more time for social participation. When they're here, it's good for me because I know she's in good hands for at least, a day. She doesn't necessarily need me all day that day, so I could go out and do things that I want to do. And as I said earlier, it's not just amount of services that was important, type of service. So in particular, a lot of young people wanted a need that was kind of emotional support, enabling the person they care for to pursue outside activities, employment courses, art courses, volunteering, those sorts of things. And it wasn't quite apparent where that service would come from, or so the type of the service was very, very important. And was seen as very helpful if it was received. And then other aspects of services that were also important, the relationship with the practitioner of both the carer and the person with support needs, continuity of care, and this last one was important about involving the young person in discussions about, in trying to access services, in provision of service, treatment plan, diagnosis, prognosis, a lot of things like that was quite important. So the second thing that I'll just touch briefly on, how this differs from other research, is the age or the life stage that the young people were at. So many of them had already been caring since quite a young age. So in our survey, the average age people started was 12, and some were as young as 4, and 40% had started when they were in primary school. So these are very formative times for education. And there was often difficulties accessing services. I think we know that there are long wait lists and delays generally, but young people's age often counted against them in trying to get services. And what this meant was, in some cases, the caring situation had deteriorated in the meantime, and so in general, possibly by the time services came, they were not sufficient on their own to address some of the problems and issues. So there was a big need for early intervention and prevention. And these were some of the services that young people valued if they received, or flagged up as needs if they didn't get them. So support in their school and college, workplace, support for their own mental health, housing and transport, often public transport, issues with housing, not being able to have the adaptations that were needed in the house. Nearly everybody mentioned had issues with personal or household finance, difficulties with disability benefits. The carers allowance is a 21-hour rule, which means that if your college course is above 21 hours, your entire carers allowance was stopped. So for some young people, that made quite a lot of difference to whether they could be in education or not. Community services and resources, things like youth clubs, and carer support group that was age specific, and this played quite an important care coordination role, as well as signposting to other services and providing welfare advice, peer support, trips and activities. So I'm going to leave the last word to Gloucestershire Young Carers. We're on our advisory group, and they provided a commentary on our findings. So I'll put it up. There's a lot of lines, but this is it in its entirety. So there's a potential for adult social care services to have a positive impact on the young adult carer, but we need early intervention, taking into account young carers' needs, and better recognition of the services that provide emotional support for the care recipient. Thank you. Oh, my disclaimer.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to see some policy recommendations at the end, and particularly if they come from the carers themselves. What we might do, unless anyone's got any burning questions that they need to run off, we might move straight on to David's presentation and then take the question and answers at the end. So next I'd like to introduce Professor David Abbott, who's from the school, Professor of Social Policy and School Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, and as you know from the last session, he's an Associate Director of the SSCR. So David.
Did I click the wrong thing? Sorry, I thought...
Sorry, I've taken the clicker, that wasn't helpful.
Oh, is that what happened? Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
I think you have to find your presentation as well. There you go.
Thank you very much. Great, hello. So I'm reporting on a study which was about LGBTQI+, I will shorten that to LGBT in the proposal, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex plus, disabled people, and self-directed social care support in England. And the nub of what this was about was, do LGBT people, disabled people that have direct payments, personal budgets, and have personal assistance, is that continuing to be an empowering situation? Does the rhetoric of kind of choice and control that is strongly associated with personalisation still hold true for this group? You know, why wouldn't it? And a reminder in the strapline about kind of why some people had made this very deliberate leap to be in charge of their own social care. Someone saying, I wanted to be able to choose, and it's transformative if you get the right person supporting you. This was collaboration between the University of Bristol, Stonewall, Sky, and Regard. And Regard are a disabled people's organisation of LGBT disabled folk. And really, it was a study in which I, as a researcher, was invited in. So Regard and Stonewall and Sky had been in conversation for some time about what they were hearing anecdotally from members about how some aspects of direct payments and personal budgets weren't working, how some relationships between recipients and personal assistants were difficult or problematic, and they wanted to see in a slightly more systematic way what was going on. So kind of apropos the panel on involvement, it was an interesting study because in a way, as a researcher, I was the one that was being involved in this kind of pre-existing relationship and discussion. And in contrast to this positive quote about the transformative experience of having good self-directed social care, the same person reflected on what it had been like when they were in receipt of kind of agency care, where they weren't doing the hiring and firing, and the person was thinking back, and she says, I think people are not aware of how miserable it is for people when you're afraid of your own home, because that's what it boils down to. If you think they, the carers, just hate you for who you are, I mean, you're dreading them coming in the morning, what's the point of care if you can't use it to be yourself? And this is one of the kind of overarching ideas really about what good social care support might look like in a way which helps you with your identified needs, but also bolsters your sense of self or your identity or your sense of feeling included in your community. Because for a while we were doing a bit of head scratching about, well, what does an LGBT social care need look like as opposed to a X other social care need, in terms of, you know, having a shower is roughly having a shower. So it was in a large way some of these other aspects of support about people feeling that they could be themselves and that they could be out, or they could be part of communities that mattered to them. And so our central research question really was about whether people felt empowered by a system which is designed and set up to be empowering, ostensibly. So we did an online survey of folks that we could find, which was a kind of by hook or by crook approach to finding people. Social media, snowballing, advertising, a whole range of different approaches. And we then did interviews with 20 of those. We also did a focus group with support workers who supported LGBT disabled people. I'm not going to say anything about that today, but it was interesting. We created a number of resources. I'll show you the link. There were some gaps in our data. It was overwhelmingly white, and it's kind of can be a bit of a recurring theme. I've noticed it a bit today too in some of the demographics. We tried hard to remedy that without a great deal of success, and it perhaps speaks to the fact that perhaps the project could have been designed more inclusively with a wider range of kind of stakeholders and community groups who might have felt more involved in it and invested. We also didn't recruit or interview that many people with learning disabilities, so the sample was overwhelmingly white and people with physical support needs. So we were interested in the kind of issue of being out to someone with whom you actually have potentially a relatively close and interesting relationship. And more than half of those surveyed said that they never or only sometimes disclosed their sexual orientation or their gender identity to the PAs who they paid to support them. Less than a third said that they were very comfortable talking about their support needs relating to being LGBT with their PAs. And this kind of spectrum of in or out kind of came about for a number of reasons. One of the main ones was simply the lack of choice, the lack of good quality PAs, and that there was a sense that outness was great, but perhaps a bit of a luxury. So someone says here, if I fire someone, I've got to have an alternative. You can't find someone in 2 or 3 hours. It's meant I've had to put up with more bad behaviour if I hadn't had to think, well, what's the alternative? So coming out could be risky if you felt you were going to get an adverse reaction and see your PA heading for the door, and if you didn't think you had good quality support lined up, you might think twice. Someone says, you need the help and there aren't always a big pool of people. You don't want to rule out potential people. And okay, if they're good at the physical stuff, sometimes that has to be the only consideration and you can't be too picky. I'm not really in a place where I can be spectacularly selective about the people that I hire. So, given that the people in the survey are, I know you'll know this, but the kind of the bosses of this thing, this is the whole point, they're kind of doing the hiring and firing of their PAs, they're having that kind of choice and control. Perhaps it was a surprise, maybe more than a third said that they had experienced discrimination or received poor treatment from their PA for a reason they felt was explicitly linked to their sexual orientation or gender identity. And there were some interesting, wrong word, not some powerful examples of this. One of the examples was a guy with a learning disability who had his own flat. He had support that he paid for coming into the flat a few times a week, and he talked about a support worker who came in, and he had a copy of Gay Times out just on his coffee table or something, and the support worker said, oh, I think you should put that away. That's kind of like a private thing. That's not something I feel I should have to see. And so what he talked about then was that he talked about his secret cupboard. I've got a secret cupboard where I put my gay stuff. And he talked about the fact that he would love to have a rainbow flag on his wall, but he said, I just can't. And I mean, apart from it made me furious, but it also, it was a real interesting way in which this guy who had his own place and had worked very hard to set up his own support package was feeling very kind of controlled and judged by this particular support worker, and was really modifying his behaviour as a result. And then one of the trans folks in the study also talked about a very problematic relationship. She was coming in the morning, the support worker, telling me I needed to strip naked and have a hot bath and pray to Jesus. She was saying I should put a flannel against my genitals to shrink them back so they'd be more appealing to men. Well, I don't need someone telling me there's anything wrong with my genitals. I don't use them most of the time. I'm trans, it felt abusive. But again, these were both examples of people who, were not confident that there was a ready supply of alternative support workers, and that idea of putting up with bad behaviour because of the lack of alternatives was something that people discussed. We wanted to know whether at the point at which folks' social care needs were assessed and or reviewed by social workers or other social care professionals, whether their needs as an LGBT disabled person was discussed at all or raised. And more than 90% of the people that completed the survey said that those needs were either not considered or only given some consideration when their needs were assessed or reviewed, and most said that they just weren't asked. that it just hadn't come up as a topic of conversation, even though there will have been something explicit on the assessment form about relationships, sex and sexuality. And one of the people that we interviewed talked about how he had taken matters into his own hands because he had seen the form that was being completed, and he had seen the box which was not being ticked and not being asked about. And he said, so I picked it up and I said to her, the social worker, what's this? And there was a box about my sexuality, and she hadn't asked me. And I said, well, what's this bit? You haven't filled it in. He said, oh, I never bother with that. I don't think it's really relevant. But actually, it's important that we're represented within these things, and people know that trans people and queer people are being seen. And I said to her, well, I'm going to fill it in. It felt a bit too much like sweeping it under the carpet, and I don't want to be swept under the carpet. So, linked to this was the kind of confidence and that people may or may not have had to proactively raise the topic of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and less than a third in the survey said that they were comfortable about talking about these needs. I don't feel confident talking to her. I'm worried they might say something. I know they shouldn't, but it's difficult. I think there was a sense that people felt that there was some kind of discourse of, which is understandable but regrettable, about, in the current climate, I'm lucky to be getting anything, so I don't know whether I should be also saying, but what about me as a sexual person, or what about these other aspects of my identity, because I know other people would say I'm lucky to be getting this. So there was some of that going on. A third of the folks said that they felt they'd been discriminated against by their local authority on the grounds of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And again, at the assessment, this is someone referring to the assessment, I asked at my assessment about my need to take part in gay community events, and they said we don't pay for gay sex. And I hadn't mentioned sex, it was insulting and humiliating. So they were kind of relatively gloomy kind of set of findings in some ways, but important to remember that some of the obvious benefits and challenges of self-directed social care support, which people did talk about. So people said that when the relationship was working well and that they were feeling that they did have control over the support arrangements, it really confirmed to them that this way of having their social care delivered was the right one for them. Most people said they'd like an increase in their funded hours, often for what was often called social hours. Talked about quite high levels of isolation. Someone saying, I'd like more hours, I don't really get to go out places, to enjoy myself. An odd phrase, social hours. I get it, but it was often very constraining and could be very limited. One youngish man who lived in quite a rural setting wanted to go to a gay rugby event, which happened once a month, but it was quite a distance for him, and he kind of argued about it, and he got given, I'm not going to remember the number, I'm sorry, but let's say he got given like 3 social hours for the PA to go with him to this thing, but the thing itself was an hour's drive. So he could get to the thing, he could stay for a very short time, and then it was time to go back. And he, in the end, he kind of felt, this isn't working. And because he wasn't out to parents and friends, there weren't other people who could just kind of naturally take him to this thing. And people said it was difficult to recruit and retain good PAs, and there was sometimes a lack of guidance or support with these recruitment processes. So I've given you a headline. Headline findings, and so my kind of observations really, just a concern or question about whether austerity was just really kind of biting here, whether this idea that social support was seen as a luxury rather than a right, somehow the kind of cherry on the top, and you couldn't really have an expectation that your needs as a LGBT person could be seriously considered. People talked a lot in the interviews. They would say to me, what are other people doing? How are other people managing this? Where are other people advertising? How are other people kind of managing difficult issues with their PAs? And we became acutely aware, I suppose, of what we knew in terms of challenges to youth-led organisations, independent living organisations, self-advocacy organisations that certainly in the past had a stronger function in supporting people through some of those things. Now that they still exist in places, but they're under massive constraint. I mean, they're gloomy findings, but I need to keep saying, that people were saying that when it works well, it's life-changing. And there were lovely examples of people being, for example, supported by their PA to go to Pride, or to go to events that they wanted to do, or where just come some very natural bonds which were important that had been formed. Methodologically, one of the things that we asked about was why people had decided to take part in the research when we did the one-to-ones. And it was very striking to me that the inclusion of our partners of Stonewall and Regard had a very big impact on people's decision whether to take part or not. And very many of them said, if I'd had a letter from the University of Bristol asking me to take part in the research, I would have put it in the bin. But we know who Stonewall are, we know who Regard are, we know what their values are, we know that they'll be coming from kind of social model place, we know that they'll be coming from a respectful place, we think that they might be engaged in doing something with the research. So I found that very useful and interesting. The literature on support workers is interesting and rich and varied, and I've just noted some of the work here. Jill Manthorpe is here, and some of her work talks really interesting about kind of role blurring and the boundaries in relationships between PAs and users, and I think that's really fascinating. And there's also been really interesting work by Williams and Shakespeare and Katie Graham, and I think some of our work fits nicely into that. I think it also says something additional about this intersecting layer of gender identity or sexual orientation. So my last slide, I have this kind of question about solidarity. Here's the quote. I feel there's no solidarity. People I think of as allies, when I say to them, look, social care isn't enough, it's community responsibility, and they just back off. That sense of we are family, we've lost that. And people like me are completely dependent on the family of the community. And in a large part what this person was saying was what lots of other people were saying, which was about they were finding very little welcome or support from the broader, wider LGBT community who can operate with very normative ideas of what bodies should be and look like, and commercial venues which are concerned with commerce rather than inclusion and accessibility. And what some of these folks were saying, which spoke, which I felt very acutely aware of and perhaps stung by as a gay man myself, they're saying, we've kind of like been on the Pride marches, and my disabled allies, we've been on the Pride marches for LGBT equality, and now we need the community to help us. And they're not helping us. We're not having that reciprocity. We're not having that solidarity. And I think that's a kind of important and provocative challenge. We created a range of resources. As a policy recommendations document, we made a couple of short films, a briefing paper, and they're all free to look at on the Sky website. Usual disclaimer, which we will are severely beaten if we don't share this. Thank you very much.
Exceptionally well timed. Thank you. That was the sort of presentation that makes you realise how important this sort of research is. It's very easy, I think, to be seduced by the fact that life has changed for certain groups of people beyond recognition, which in some ways it has. But having this sort of this qualitative information on just how difficult it can be, I think, just demonstrates the value of research. Our final presenter is Jessica Samsey from King's, and her colleagues Laura Cole and Jim Manthorpe are in the room. I think I said, just right in front of me. Jessica is a research fellow in the NIHR Health and Social Care Workforce Research Unit at King's College College London with her colleagues Laura and Jill, and also a fellow at the NIHR School for Social Care Research. So we'll have his presentation and then we'll have a joint Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. And thanks to you all for sticking around, especially on a day when I realize it's quite sunny and it's long. It's still a novelty for the time of year. So thank you very much for sticking around. I just want to say that I want to start. So I'm going to be presenting about the study that we did, looking at whether there was an optimal time for people with dementia to move into a care home. And I want to start with just acknowledging the research team, Jill Manthorpe for her guidance and support, and Laura Cole for doing all the field work and who's virtually been the backbone of the study. We belong to the Health and Social Care Workforce Research Unit, like Lisa said. And I'm going to talk, the format of the presentation is fairly simple. I'm going to really briefly touch on the background, the methodology, the study aims, and then dwell as much as possible on the findings. So I know I tend to talk quite fast and may even speed up because I realize it's the last session. So bear with me. It's the findings that I will really slow down at because that's the best part of the study. And I'm happy, obviously, to take questions at the end. So I will slow down at that point. So just by background, I've worked in dementia research for about 15 years now, and we've interviewed people in care homes, we've interviewed people in the community, and never really understood this transition of at what point do people decide to move into a care home. People just seem to live in a care home or they live in the community in the way we had previously done research. So we were quite curious about how do they make these decisions? How do these decisions really emerge? Who kind of leads these decisions and how it evolves for a person with dementia to decide to move into a care home? Does it only happen at a time of crisis or an emergency? Or is it quite a decision that the family makes, the individual makes? And in the context of the Mental Capacity Act and people making their own decisions for the future, we were quite curious how these decisions kind of played out. It was also addressed as it was also addressed by the James Lind Alliance and the Alzheimer's Society in that priority setting exercise that they conducted as something that was quite important. And so we got funded by the School for Social Care Research for a 3-year study. The first part of the study was a systematic review, and the reference is down there, where we looked at what other researchers had done in the field, and it's been quite difficult for people to actually pick out whether or not there's an optimal time. We've kind of used the word optimal just because it was used in the priority setting exercise, but of course we acknowledge that it's not that straightforward. Everyone might have an individual approach to what is optimal or best time, and we were quite curious about how this kind of worked. As we don't know when it's the right time, it becomes quite difficult to know how to advise individuals. It becomes quite difficult to know what messages people are getting. They're quite conflicting messages for people with dementia as well as older people and carers about what might happen if they get diagnosed with dementia. Carers seem to get conflicting messages as well about what might be the best way to make these decisions. Availability of care homes gets overlooked often and options for what might be a first step towards moving into a care home. Carers feel unsupported, and there's general negativity around care homes. So around this context, and in this context itself, we were quite curious about how these decisions were made. So our study aims, like I said, was a 3-year study, 3-part study. We used a mix of methods. The first was a systematic review. The second were qualitative interviews, which is what I'm going to dwell on. And these were the 3 main aims that we were driven by. We wanted to look at what the factors were that that people used to make the decision to move into a care home. We were curious about the drivers of the decision. Who were the people who kind of initiated these? Were they practitioners? Were they social workers? Were they GPs when the diagnosis was made? Was it family carers? Was it the person with dementia themselves? There's been so much talk around this. We were quite curious about who the drivers of these decisions were. And ultimately, we really were just curious what constitutes an optimal or best time for a person with dementia to move into a care home. Methodologically, like I said, the first part was a systematic review, and I'm going to be talking mostly about the qualitative interviews that we conducted. We asked the experts. We asked care home managers and social workers. We interviewed 20 care home managers and 20 social workers who we presented, the findings of which we presented last year. And we interviewed family carers and residents with dementia who had already moved into a care home to look back on their experiences and tell us about how it played out, how these decisions came about, who talked to whom, how they were initiated, and kind of talk us through the experience of making this decision. We conducted face-to-face qualitative interviews, and we conducted a basic thematic analysis using principles of phenomenology and interpretation. And the third part of the study is a survey, which again, we're not going to be focusing on today, but anyone who's interested can get in touch. We've conducted a factorial survey with social care practitioners working with dementia to see how people make these decisions in real world situations using little vignettes that we developed from the qualitative findings. So today, I'm going to focus on residents with dementia who had moved into a care home in the last 6 months and family carers of residents with dementia who'd moved into a care home. We covered a mix of, we recruited from as wide a range of care homes as possible, but most of the people in the sample ended up being rural, in small towns and small cities. So we tried to capture the range as much as possible and travel, especially Laura traveled as far afield as necessary. And we interviewed 5 residents with dementia. There were 3 men, all white British, and all were self-funding. And we interviewed family carers. We interviewed 21 family carers, 12 women, 20 white British people, 1 sibling, 15 adult children, 4 spouses, and 1 adult grandchild. So as you can see, the largest group was adult children looking after a family member who had a dementia who had moved into a care home. Right? So as I promised, I will slow down now. So I'm going to talk first about findings from the family carers and the interviews that of the family carer interviews. And I'm going to touch on each of these themes really briefly, along with the participant quote, just to kind of contextualize the detail. Emotions ran really high during these interviews. Most of them were incredibly emotional. Carers often broke down. Carers often asked for a break because they were crying. It was a very, very emotional time for them. Many of them, reflecting back on this experience of having made a decision, talked about the stress they felt, how frustrated it had been. Many of them talked about feeling guilty. Many of them talked about grief of having to have made this decision for a relative with dementia. Many of them felt the responsibility of making the decision on their relative's behalf. Some of them said they weren't very sure how the relative would have reacted. Some of them felt like their relative would have been happy to make the move, but the responsibility of the burden of responsibility on making this decision was something that still weighed on them even at the time of interviews. A large number of carers tended to ruminate on whether they had done the right thing long after the move. And there was no way to know. Many of them said, I'm really still not sure whether I did the right thing or not. We asked them specifically about, do you think the timing was right? And many of them said it's not something they could ever say with certainty was yes or no about the right time, but they ruminated long after the move had happened on whether or not it was the thing to have done when they did it. And there were many all of the interviews were really peppered with these emotive metaphors of tipping point and the time has come. Many of them talk quite emotively about their experience of having made a decision for a family member. So here's a carer, this is a sister carer who says, I suppose the thing that really was the tipping point was that she wandered off and one day she was down near the MX junction and a police lady had to bring her back. This made us really think the time has come. And obviously I'm trying to just give a brief quote, but the whole context of this is this lady saying, I really deliberated about when was the time. I wasn't very sure. She was happy in her home. We moved her closer to us. But finally, we reached a tipping point when she wandered off, was a danger to having been on a motorway junction, had to be brought back by the police. And that really was the tipping point. The final time had come. Relatives talked about weighing up risks and safety almost on a regular daily basis. Many of them talked about willing to take these risks that they felt kind of hedging their best. Many of them felt that they were kind of constantly weighing up, this is happening, we realize it's risky, but we're willing to take it to make these decisions about whether to leave a relative at home or to move them into a care home. They all talked about this as being very personal, very subjective, and talked about it in family context. Many of them had other family support that they were talking to. So there were sisters making the decision or a brother, sister making the decision about an adult relative with dementia. But they all talked about it as being very subjective and very personal about when was the right time. And they talked about risks and safety, acknowledging that it was about what the level of risk and safety they were willing to take. They talked about using triggers but wanting to avoid a crisis. Almost all of them talked about this emergency, needing to move in an emergency not being ideal, not being the best time, so kind of wanting to avoid that, but using a trigger and not always knowing what the trigger was. Many of them, which we thought was really interesting, had placed on waiting lists and used this as a way of, again, just hedging their bets, kind of feeling like being on a waiting list was somewhere that gave them a sense of reassurance. And there was one particular family where the person had been waiting, had put their name on a waiting list, and when one time the call came from the care home saying a vacancy had emerged, they felt this wasn't the right time, but they wanted to remain on the waiting list. And the second time, a few months later, when the call had come from the care home, they felt, okay, now the time has come and I'm happy to take the place. So they felt that having the reassurance or the backup of this waiting list really kind of helped them. And this is the same sister carer. It's just a really good quote because she talks about she was not ready then to go into a home. She used to still go out to the shop and get her paper and do all that. Okay, used to leave her credit card all over the place, and she laughs. But later I think it was the right time for her to go into a home. I suppose we could have done it a few months earlier perhaps. I think it was all right. And I think it's really interesting because leaving your credit card around may be something that other people would think is a huge risk factor. But she was willing to take this risk because she didn't think it was such a big risk compared to moving her at that point. She was willing to wait for the tipping point, which she talked about, of her sister wandering, and feeling like that was the point at which she didn't want to take the risk anymore, and was when she decided the time had come. Many of the participants in the interviews talked about moving into a care home at a time of emergency and that this was not always ideal. But a lot of participants we also managed to recruit who talked about that this could be a choice, that they had kind of made this as a choice to move into a care home with full deliberation. Those who did move at a time of crisis said it was not always very straightforward. There was always a move to a hospital, then came back home for a bit with a care package, extended the care package, moved in for respite, tried something else out. So it wasn't decided to move into a care home, moved into a care home, and it was fine. It wasn't a straightforward journey. There were all these little side alleyways that they went into, little offshoots before the final move into a care home, at which the point at which we interviewed them. Like I said, many of them used the waiting list in a just-in-case kind of situation. And another thing we found really interesting is that many participants and many of the social workers that we interviewed as another part of the study talked about using respite as a way for people to try out living in a care home and seeing whether it worked. It gave the carer a break, but it made them open up these discussions about, would you like to live there would you like to live there permanently? Is this something we could be discussing? Respite was a way that they used to kind of open these out and see how it actually worked for all concerned. Family carers talked about visiting homes, and as you can imagine, many of them valued the things that they valued are things that must come up in the literature as well, about the feel of the place. Many of them said they could identify this by just caring staff. They talked about the convenience. They talked about whether or not it was convenient to them so that they could visit more frequently, and knowing what to go for. Not everyone knew exactly how to determine whether or not this is a good care home or a bad care home, but they knew it if they went in and felt that the place was really lovely. For instance, this family carer says, I walked in and immediately I thought, oh, this is nice. It was not just that it looked nice, but you felt a certain atmosphere and warmth about the place, without it being showy or artificial in any way, a genuine home from home. We also had a carer who talked about moving their relative into a care home where everything looked spanking new and was wonderful. But after a few months of living there, she realized the care wasn't as warm and as cozy as she really wanted it for her parent, and then moved them into a place that may not have looked so beautiful aesthetically, but was something that they were much more comfortable with, and the feel of the place was much nicer and was different. Sadly, a lot of them were deeply frustrated about the lack of support they received. They talked about not knowing where to turn to. There was limited understanding, especially about payments, as you can imagine, what entitlements were, especially relevant to timing, because people didn't really know how long money would last and what would happen if the money ran out. Many of them were making decisions based, especially with something like dementia, never really knowing how long it would last, how long they would need the care home, and when to make this decision. They were disappointed by the lack of support from social services, but especially if they were self-funding. Social workers, they said, just gave them a list and said, go to the CQC website, look at care homes, go visit them yourself. A large number of people relied on family networks, but obviously this kind of threw up these different family dynamics, conflicts about what was the right time for a family member. And so this carer says, it's up to you to find a care home, and this is new to me, brand spanking new. We haven't got a clue. So we go to the experts and say, tell us what to do and tell us who to go to and who is going to be good and who is not, and I will pay. And they still say, no, you've got to sort it out yourself. And many of them really, really struggled with this, that they were struggling with knowing what was the right time, knowing how to deal with a parent who was struggling with dementia in their own home without enough care, and not even having the support of making this decision about when to move into a care home. One of the most interesting dyads was two sister carers who were looking after a parent. And at the end of the interview, when we asked them, so do you think this was the best time when you could have done the move? Is there anything you would have done differently? One of the carers said, yeah, I think this was fine. I think this was the best time. And her sister said, oh, really? I would have done it much earlier. So even within the same family dynamic, people have different opinions. Even within the family dynamic, there is always these different ideas about what is the best time and how it can be played out. And just briefly, I'm going to talk about these two themes that we've identified from interviews with residents with dementia. Many people the 5 people we interviewed with dementia, so it's obviously not the largest sample, but they talked about these mixed feelings. Many of the people we were interviewing 6 months after they'd moved in talked about the mixed feelings they had in hindsight, never very sure whether or not it was the right thing, and they found it quite hard to kind of imagine what it would be like if they hadn't moved. There was a range of involvement recall. Many of them said that the decision had just been made for them, to being actively involved. Some of them remembered being actively involved in the decision and having been part of this whole decision-making process with their family carers. Some acknowledged the availability of limited options and requiring backup of nearby family. So there was especially this one lady with dementia who moved, having left a wonderfully rich social circle behind, but said, I moved because I need the backup of my family. And there's early indications, but really positive indications about involving the person with dementia has benefits in maintaining positive attitudes to living in a home, and I'll come back to that. So this particular person says, well, I just accepted it because I could see that we needed some help. We needed some family near us. I wasn't happy to leave that area because I was so happy there. And it has been quite difficult, but I made myself do it. And when we said, what kind of help did you feel you needed? Well, just backup. It wasn't physical help and it wasn't help to do with the housework or anything like that. But we felt that we needed somebody near us to back us up over things. And this person with dementia was very aware that her friends may not have been able to support her in the same way as family, and that she needed to make the move at this point because her backup of family was always nearer than they would have been if she lived further away. And finally, we just asked them about, is there an optimal time? And like I said, many of them found it quite difficult to imagine what life would have been like if they hadn't moved. And they were colored by these images of the positive image of home life and what would have happened if they just stayed in their own home. Many of them mourn for the life left behind, and we were quite curious about how linkages are maintained, because lots of them, especially this particular lady with dementia, talked about her whole social circle. She could walk down the street and everyone would recognize her, whereas now obviously life was very different as she had moved closer to her family. But it was really interesting how having a positive attitude quite helped. Many of them who had been involved in the decision talked about, but I've come to accept it. We've talked about it. It's something that I've come to accept. It's something that I knew was happening. And life is fine. It's not ideal, but it's fine. I've come to accept it. And I just want to mention this quote, because this particular person was living in a home where everyone was a little bit had more severe conditions than him, and he found it quite restrictive how he couldn't leave. And he said, we don't leave the camp, you don't leave the site, which is restrictive, but I quite understand. They've got to do that because otherwise somebody will wander off and you don't know what would happen. So he found it all very limiting and restrictive, but the fact that he was able to move beyond that and say, I see why it's done, it's still nice here, I'm quite happy with it, was hugely dependent on the fact that he'd been quite involved in the decision, and his family had been really involved in talking to him about it as he moved into a care home. And so as a final slide, we just bringing it all together, is that obviously, as hopefully I've conveyed, that the best optimal time is hugely individual, not apparently related to any stage of severity. And we were impressed by how many opportunities there may be in the system for creating or looking at what might be an optimal time, such as being on a waiting list, checking out respite, seeing what these options for trying out moving into a care home if someone decides to do that. The emotion and strain, whether in an emergency or plan, highlighted the family approach to move and settling. So there were large family dynamics involved in how these kind of decisions were made. But it was quite evident that relatives felt they shouldered the burden of enormous responsibility and felt that information and advice was not enough. Many of them felt they were simply signposted with lists of care homes to look at, and any kind of personal questions were not really answered. It was really just go out and see what you can find. And for a life-changing decision, we were really surprised that the lack of support was so dire for people with dementia as well as carers. And I think, again, another thing that we're quite struck by is that involving people with dementia in the decision may be something that sustains people to move into these care homes with more positive attitudes and just more adaptation to kind of come to terms with this decision, and many view it as lifting the burden on their family member if they are involved in the decision. Have to say, though, we are aware that there's risk of study sample bias, that those who participate in the research in itself may be more positively driven. And finally, just to say thank you to you all, but the next steps is that we are working with the Alzheimer's Society to produce fact sheets. Jill has had input onto that fact sheet, and we're talking to other public advisors. And thanks to our participants who gave us their time. Thank you.
There are so many opportunities to do this better. There are lots of ideas in there, which is very encouraging about respite and supporting people. And what I'm going to do now is ask Nick and David to join Critica. Do you want to take some steam, or is that the best way of doing it? And we'll have 10 minutes of questions. Let's go for it. So, do you have any questions? We have a microphone here. Is it on? Yes, it is on. Any questions for the panel? Yes, it is.
Just a question, Katika, about your study. I just wondered if any of the carers spoke about talking with their relatives early in their stage of dementia to think about, it's not exactly advanced care planning, but to think ahead about when their condition deteriorates.
Yeah, some of them did, not a lot. Some of them who had made the decision in a planned manner said they had talked to their thing, but lots of them felt that this wasn't quite an appropriate time, and not knowing when the time was, because they felt quite acutely that when they'd been diagnosed was probably not the most appropriate time, but not knowing when things would get severe, because it wasn't quite a straightforward trajectory of 6 months later you'll get worse, 6 months after you'll have something happen. So none of them, all of them felt that talking at the time of diagnosis was probably not the most appropriate, and never knowing since then when would have been the most appropriate time to have addressed it.
Did anybody talk about the trigger? So that the woman who was wandering down the motorway, so early in the diagnosis, that people say talk about those kind of things and saying actually, parents saying actually, daughter, if I go wandering down the motorway, that's the time.
Oh, did the rest? Oh, I see. Did the relative with dementia say any? No, lots of them tried different things before it resulted in a care home move. So especially that lady whose sister had been found wandering, they moved her from a further away area to a house closer to them, then moved her into respite, then tried something else, then got a larger care package. So they tried lots of things before deciding a care home move was the last thing. There was no one who had talked to, who the relative with dementia had said anything of, at this point, move me into a care home and I'll be fine with that. Okay. Yeah?
Can I ask
Yeah.
that?
So I should have asked you to introduce yourself, Kate.
Sorry, Kate Baxter.
Laura, yes.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, I'm Laura, I've worked on the project with Critica, and just to say there was one resident, one family carer who had 3 members of family that at different times moved to a care home, and they said that the first time the family member moved to a care home, it was very chaotic and very unpleasant. The second time they had a bit more experience in that, so it was a bit more planned and they had the experience. And by the third time, they had actually discussed it with, I think it was the only person who had actually discussed it with their family member. But the family member had been on that journey with them as well through the end. So they said by the third time it happened, it was perfect because the person had been involved in it from the start, and they had made that decision about if that happened to me, then this is what I want to happen. But that was very
a few dry runs.
Hi, I'm Sarah from LSE. I was just wondering, because you said you were going to make these information sheets up. What's going to be included in that? Is it to assist with decision making, and if so, how are you developing this?
So the third part of the study is this factorial survey, looking at how social care practitioners working with people with dementia make these decisions. So we are still kind of identifying how decisions are made in practice about when someone decides a person with dementia should be moved into a care home. So we are still working out on the finer points of what these practice guidance would look like.
So it's
For-
guidance.
Sorry?
Sorry, it's practice guidance
Yes,
for
yes.
professionals.
Yes, For professionals, but also the fact sheet with the Alzheimer's Society about how the decision can be made, the things to think about, because we can't say with any certainty what the timing would be, but it's the things to think about, the things to kind of consider, what questions to ask either the care home manager, or the social worker, the things to kind of look out for.
Okay, super. Yeah, I was just wondering because we're kind of thinking of doing a similar thing for decision making for the knee replacement. So I was just wondering how you were going to develop that information, who you were going to develop it with, if there were going to be stakeholders involved, and what you see as how you think it's going to help the process.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you're just around the corner. So
Yes, I was going to say I will talk to you.
There's someone in the back row. Start with you.
Sorry, question for David on that LGBTQI. What was the breakdown of the trans and intersex and bi?
We were really pleased that we had, I should have put the numbers, but we had a really good spread of LGBT QI+. We had a significant number of trans folk to part. I think that was partly because we had an early kind of quite big community event to publicise the launch of the thing, and some trans community groups came, and they obviously kind of thought it was a sound endeavour, and they were really good at kind of promoting it, and so yeah, we were pleased with that kind of spread across kind of different, sexual orientation and gender identity labels.
There's somebody in front of you, if you'd like to cross the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Michelle from Southampton. It's a question for David. Did you say that people had not got very much help in the kind of recruitment stage? Did you say that people hadn't been given much help when they were recruiting EAs? Is that right?
Yeah, I think people felt that they were largely working out by themselves, and that's why they were saying to me, oh, do people ever put an advert in X, or have people ever done Y? And it was one of the reasons that we thought that one of our outputs would be kind of based on people talking about what they had done, because people said, oh, I'd like to know what other people are doing in relation to this.
Because you could envisage that people could be helped to try and kind of screen out some of the, if people held religious or cultural or political views that you personally don't share, that you could screen that out, and that wouldn't actually be too complicated thing to do, but actually would be very helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some people kind of talked about the way that they try to gauge something about a person in front of them without necessarily coming out. Often one of the proxies was that they would kind of ask questions to try and gauge whether the person was racist or not. And they took this as a proxy for a kind of closeness to whether they would be homophobic or not. But people kind of, there's a choice even at the interview stage, isn't there, about how you're going to gauge someone's. If you decide that you don't want to come out at the interview, and some people weren't out in interviews, then yeah, it's about kind of finding proxy questions. But 20 odd years ago, when I worked on a different project about direct payments for young disabled people, those kind of peer support opportunities within independent living organisations or ULOs, they were much more developed. There were more places where you could signpost people to who could say, well, how are you managing it, or a repository of support and information, and some of those things still exist, but not so many.
Thank you. So the gentleman next to you, and then we'll pass it over to Mark for the red card.
Thanks to all the speakers. It's nice to see passion within research as well. You're obviously all very interested in your subject. David, just going back to your study, 1992 was the first time I took someone on the Pride March with a wheelchair user. I think there were 6 of us at the front of the London Pride March. It doesn't sound like things have got much more inclusive since then, which is a shame. Just as a point for information, in East Sussex right now there's an 11% vacancy rate amongst home care and support work staff, and 11% of the staff employed are European and may not have leave to remain in the country. So when we are advertising for brain injury support workers in our local area, we pay up to £18, £19 an hour for the most behaviourally challenging people, sort of £12 to £13 an hour for those who are not so challenging. There are occasions when we're receiving no replies whatsoever to our posts. literally no replies at all. So my concern for people who are receiving direct payments, where they won't be receiving as much money as £13 an hour, is that there is a very small pool of people, increasingly small pool of people to choose from. And so unfortunately, it increasingly looks like a luxury to have your sexuality recognised within your support package. So a comment rather than a question, sadly.
No, that's helpful, and it just so several people use that phrase "bad bargain." You know, I'm going to have to make a bad bargain, which I just thought flew so massively in the face of where it had come from, the idea of having choice and control. But yeah, no, you're right.
Margaret, in the breast
I want to get back onto the third study, but did you want to make a comment on that?
It was that one.
Do you want to do yours first?
Yeah, it's just to back up what that gentleman said. We're together.
Sorry, could you say where you're from?
Yeah, I'm Amanda Mullins. I'm one of the involved team. But my brother's learning disabled and autistic. He's not LGBTIQ, but he basically, when we put out, when he had personal assistance, he's now gone into supported living. But when he had personal assistance, we had one person apply. So what do? Do you take that one person? He only had 6 hours a week care, and it ended up it was a man who was retired who was going to do it for something to do, and we had to take him because there was nobody else. So I think it is really, really difficult to get support workers. I was quite pleased when he went off a personal budget and we got him in supported living, because then at least I knew that he'd always have a pool of carers there. But it's a really hard situation you're dealing with without putting the LGBT and all the problems that you found in that up. It totally astounds me that in this day and age it's still existing. Homophobia, but obviously it is. I mean, I walk on private myself. I have gay members of my family and support all of them. But it's really hard for me to hear that's still a problem.
Thank you. Margaret. And then I think we'll start wrapping up.
Sorry, just to go back to the next one. I think you mentioned about the availability of a place in the care home. Was that a pressure point for people to think of moving someone earlier than it might have done because the space came up, or do you pick that up?
Yes and no. There were, it wasn't a majority, but there were quite a few people who had a space on a waiting list. And one of them talked about getting a call from the care home manager about a vacancy, but deciding it wasn't the right time and moving them would have been quite stressful. So they decided not to take it, but a vacancy came up again. So there was this pressure point exactly about feeling like needing to make these decisions was based on the level of availability. Most of the participants that we interviewed were self-funding. So I realized that in itself makes quite a difference to the sample compared to those who may be placed by local authorities. So the fact that they were self-funding many of them talked about having a lot more choice in the care homes that they could go to, and that the care homes that they did choose were of their own volition. So that it is probably atypical of large swaths of the country.
I'm just going to ask one last question, then we'll close. It's for Nick. I was intrigued by something earlier when Cassie talked about how she was recruited into your young adult carers study, and David talked about Stonewall and how helpful that was. How did you recruit your young adult carers?
Onto the advisory group.
And your participants.
Okay, so onto the advisory group, we went through, again we worked with a couple of charities, so Carers Trust and Children's Society, and they advertised it through their groups, their Twitter accounts, I think it came via Twitter, their e-bulletin, and sort of through their networks. So I think that was really, really helpful, going through their network.
So it helps to be creative about how you use social media and third sector organisations.
And people who have already got those connections, I think.
Lovely, thank you. I thought that was a fantastic session. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Varied and three really interesting research projects. I've been asked to thank you all for coming to the overall conference as well. I think it's been a wonderful day. Certainly I've been coming to these conferences for a few years now, and this I think is the biggest, and I think it's been a really good occasion. So thank you very much for coming today. I think you'll get an email asking me to provide a to the conference and the slides. So I'm pleased to, as everybody asked you to, please fill in those evaluations. Unless anyone else has got anything to add, thank you so much and have a safe trip home. Thank you.